he's a regular volunteer at the Champaign Air Museum in Urbana and the Waco Museum in Troy. I think the program he has today is a personal note. My brother could well be part of this program. So please make a welcome, honest welcome to Bill Albers, please.
Thank you. I have a foreign accent, you already noticed that, and that's Dutch. And there aren't that many Dutch people, so I said, God, I never heard that before. This is what I might have seen, must have seen, because I was 5 years old at the end of World War II. Over the area that I lived in Amsterdam, we were in the path of the British Bomber Command at night, and during the day, the 8th Air Force out of England. Every day, 4 times a day, if the weather permitted. So, this is a pretty lengthy program. I will show as much as I can, and if you have to leave, I'm not insulted. For those, I just keep on going until there's nobody left. 1942-45. We're talking here about the B-17, which is the one on the left, and the B-24s. Yours was a B-24, right, Wayne?
Yes.
Okay. There were 16 million Americans served in the military during World War II. Can you hear me?
Yep.
The gentleman over there is...
You hear Don?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay.
Very right.
A total of 400,000 Americans died in World War II. And most people don't know that 72,000 are still unaccounted for and never found them. They know they're dead. There's only World War II. The young people that were in the armed forces in those days, like this airman here, the Marine, the Army, and the Navy, and of course the very young aviators, they made up that 16 million. If we break down the World War II losses, 220 men died each day, 6,600 each month. Those are staggering numbers, you know, of death. This is the kind of people that were serving. The 19-year-olds. They enlisted or they got drafted. In 1944, the Army Air Force, as we call that, some people call it the Army Air Corps, which is an older name, had 1.25 million servicemen in uniform. And they had only about 80,000 airplanes scattered all over the world. Of the B-17, there was 12,731 built. This airplane is made out of ribs, stringers, and skin, and that holds that whole airplane together. It's a very sturdy airplane. The B-24, which is a different airplane, a high wing, 16,188 were used, and those were used mostly in the southern part of Europe, North Africa, and of course also in the Southeast Asia. The 8th Air Force, which is stationed in England, ETO means European Theater of Operation. They had B-17 and B-24 groups, a total of 40 groups. They lost 26,000 men and 4,300 bombers. Now when you say lose, what do you mean? A flat tire and they crashed? No, they were blown out of the sky. They hit the ground. And there were 26,600 men. Each airplane carries 10 men. You say, that 43,000, there had to be at least 43,000 men. Yes, there were. Some were lucky to be able to jump out and parachute out. Many did not. You combine the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force, which is flew out of Italy, 37,500 men died. And the total bombers lost in air combat was 6,800. It's staggering numbers, you know, those are big airplanes. Here's the B-24. The B-24 has up front, just like the B-17. A bombardier sits up front, behind the little window, this dome, as you want to call that. Behind him sits the navigator, the pilot and the co-pilot. Those four guys were officers. Then right behind the co-pilot and the pilot is the flight engineer, radio operator, ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, 1 on each side, and then the tail gunner. Makes up 10 men. And there's a total 12 to 13, depending on the model of the airplane, 50 caliber machine guns. That's why they call it, it's a misnomer, they call it a fortress. The United States Army Air Corps in 1939 had only 2,400 airplanes. The United States wasn't ready at all for war in those days. And that's 39, only a couple of years away from the war. Roosevelt, of course, got this started, this war effort, through the Land-Lease program. A lot of people got re-employed during those days, and they ordered very large quantities of P-47 Thunderbolts fighters, Lightnings, and Mustangs. Here is the Thunderbolt. They call him the Juggernaut, a very sturdy fighter. Then the P-38 Lightning, Lockheed made, and the North American Aviation P-51. What motivated those young airmen to volunteer for the Army Air Force? First, I can tell you what they really tell me. My number was up anyway. I am not going to go in the Army. So why not go be a flyboy? It was very, looks like kind of neat. They didn't know what they were getting into. So there was a heavier recruitment by the government through posters, clubs, even Kiwanis, stimulating the young boys to sign up, patriotism, and then of course the pressure from friends, relatives to go to war and be a patriot. Well, Uncle Sam had a lot of posters. They were plastered all over the place, and of course this really did it. That was December 1941, Pearl Harbor, right? That brought a lot of people to the recruiting offices. They lined up. So, but we really needed, in the first part of the war, we needed candidates for the Army Air Force. And the young people that you see here, the 19-year-olds, he still has his little baby doll here. Those are the kind of guys that signed up. Bill Dean from Sydney, he became a B-26 pilot, 19 years old. Look at the baby face. The Army Air Force procurement in 1941 called to deploy 30,000 pilots and 100,000 technicians. Technicians means guys that will work on the airplane, on tanks, not on tanks, on airplanes, and whatever else the Air Force had. In 1932, we had 1,646 airplanes. In 36, only 855. There was not going to be a war anyway. People were anti-war in those days. But in 1941, they already ratcheted up to 6,777 and then 152,000 men. Haven't started the war yet. The recruitment was in place. The Army Air Force received 2,372,000 highly qualified men. To be in the Air Force, you better have something. You were not really, if you did any killing at all, it had to be from way above. To get 30,000 pilots, they had 300,000 applicants. And of those 300,000, 60,000 entered the program. And of those 60,000, half of them didn't make it. So 50% ended up, only the best made it. Now on the ground, for each 7 men on the ground, 4 were technical guys, the technicians. All military men were tested and categorized in groups. They had 5 levels that the Army tested people for: mental, their physical part, and their aptitudes. And they were asked then, did you have the right, what kind of skills did you have? Were you a machinist? Were you a farm boy? Did you run combines? Did you do any work on the farms? Did you have experience? Did you have a college education? Did you have 1, 2, 3, or 4 years of college? what kind of exceptional qualities did you have? They will find that out through the testing process. So 41% of the top 2 Army grades, so there were 5, went to the Army Air Force. 42%, they just took the top, the cream of the crop, right to the Air Force. So they needed air crews so badly, and the training program for pilots were 52 weeks. So they had to get the best and have them quick. Army Air Force training. Well, they have wanted only the best to be the aviation cadets. So in 1942 to 43, that was the first year of the war. Training was totally inadequate. Equipment was poor. Instructors had no clue what the hell they were talking about. They never saw combat. You have to prepare a 19 to 20-year-old to go to combat, but you've never seen combat yourself. The training facilities were inadequate. A lot of the crews had to sleep in tents during their training. The runways weren't done yet. They had to be plowed yet. So it was a very difficult situation. Insufficient training equipment. But every graduating class from 1943, 44, 45 got better and better and better. The veterans were coming back from the war. They became instructors and told the new class what this was all about. And that showed up in combat. Much better air crews in combat. And also the equipment got better. Where the first airplanes were, the first batch was never all that good, but man, every time from the field, the modifications came to the factories, and the factories modified the bombers so they were suitable for combat. An engineer who never seen combat designs an engineer, but he doesn't have any feeling at all what the airplane has to do in combat. So, that was in combat. Well, what happened in the continental United States? There was also some price to pay. If you look over here, you'll see the United States lost 13,873 aircraft just in training. 6,000 men were lost as a result of 52,000 accidents. That's just in the US during the time period 41 to 45. We all heard stories about the Navy airplanes at Chicago that they ended up in the water. I can imagine what it is when you fly a bomber in the mountains and you lose track of where you're at in bad weather. So in a crew position of the bombers, there are 4 officers. The bombardier, the navigator, the pilot, and the co-pilot. Those are officers. Usually second lieutenant, first lieutenant, and maybe a captain, but nothing higher than that. The NCOs were flight engineer, the top turret operator, he's a top gunner, and the radio operator, the waist gunner, and the tail gunner. There's a total then of 6 of those. Those are all sergeants, staff sergeants, except for the flight engineer, who was a tech sergeant, 1 extra stripe. Why were they officers? Why were they sergeants? Has to do with the Geneva Convention of 1929, which Germany, the US, and many other countries signed, that they would treat the prisoners of war who were NCOs or officers per a certain directive. The officers, when they were in POW camps, would not have to do anything. They can just walk around and get their food, but they're confined. They may even get a little salary, money, pocket money. The NCOs were somewhat forced to work, but not like beasts, Now, if you were a corporal or less, that's a different story. That came towards the end of the war when Bastogne when the 20,000 men were taken prisoner in Bastogne, Battle of the Bulge. Those people were of lower ranks and they didn't have it so good. But that's not Army Air Force. Here's the bombardier, your location, see the guy in front, and he operates also the chin turret guns, 250 calibers, deadly weapons, go up and down, left and right very quickly, a range of 800 yards effective, so the Germans did never attack from the front, because they knew they could barrage of 20mm shells coming at them. Here's the northern bomb site that the bombardier uses to put the bomb load on the target. Supposed to. They had to threaten those bombardiers with court-martials if they did not put those bombs on the target. Of course, many times there was so much yelling going inside the airplane, drop the damn bomb, drop the bomb, drop the bomb. They wanted to get out of that anti-aircraft gunnery over the target, so they better drop it. Well, then the next day they had to go back again, and then they lost more airplanes. So then there's the navigator, a very important man. The navigator kept track from the minute the airplane left the field in England, all the way to the target and back. He knew exactly where he was at. If he didn't, and they lost an engine, they had to fall out of formation, drop down all the way down to the ground. They had to find their way home. The navigator would get them home. He knew where they were at. Then you get the pilot, who was in command, and you see out there in the back, there are those anti-aircraft smoke, little smoke pieces out there. And those, God forbid, if you get hit by one of those, blows the whole airplane apart. The co-pilot, the flight engineer who sits on the top of the airplane, 250 calibers, he is the technical man of the airplane. People ask, well, if the turret moves around, can he shoot his own tail off? That's what you see right here. No, there's a cam inside the system that if his barrel, one of the barrels were pointing at the tail, it would lock out the trigger mechanism. Then you got the radio operator. The radio operator didn't do anything but keeping track of the communication between the airplanes in command also. He had to keep the radios going. Without a radio internally, the airplane is not functioning very well. Then you got the waist gunners, 2 guys inside. Tough job. They were all sucking oxygen at this. They were all connected up to the electricity of the airplane fuselage. They get their boots and uniforms heated up with heat. The ball turret gunner who sat in that fetal position for 6 to 8 hours, wouldn't come out. The tail gunner who sits on the tail end. Most of the tours would last 6 months. Then they go home. So they got to England 6 months later, they went home and they got different duties. If they were instructors, they would instruct. So for fighter pilots and non-bomber flight crews, total different story. 25 missions. Early in the war, there was rebellions almost within the 8th Air Force. There were so many airplanes shot down. People would come back to their barracks. Their friends were gone because they lost them that day. And they were starting to rebel. So they said, okay, after 25 missions, you can go home. Okay, that pacified them. Of course, the chances were small in those days. And then once the airplanes got better and they had lesser losses, they upped to the 30 and then later to 35. Of course, there was a lot of complaining when that happens. Oh, I was going to go home tomorrow. Now we're going to wait another 6 more. So those missions were deadly. Where could an aircrew be sent to? Well, they can go to the 8th Air Force was in England. They had 65% B-17s and 35% B-24s. Or you can go to the 15th Air Force based in Italy. Here you see a map of Europe. This is where the bombers were located. I'm born right here. You can see this is Germany. This is kind of a path that they would take a lot, deep into Germany. Here's Berlin. Here you see the bases in Italy after the invasion of Sicily and Anzio. The Germans were pushed up north across the Alps, and then the American 15th Air Force had their bases here, and they hit the Balkan area, Yugoslavia, all of southern Europe. You can see from here to go to Munich or Vienna, it's a long way. It's a lot easier for those guys to pound on them. I can say pounding because my parents told me they got pounded on for 5 years and they were not happy at campers at all. My mom would never forget and forgive the Germans. I did, course, I didn't see the suffering, but they did. You can see this is Germany, all those famous names like Bremen, Hanover, Dortmund, Düsseldorf. We've heard of all those names, and they, day after day after day, they kept pounding away at those Germans, but they couldn't break their backs. So the deployment to the ETO, European Theater, how did they get there? Well, they had to come from the US. They can go to southern Florida, Morrison Field, and then from Morrison Field they would go to Puerto Rico, to Brazil, and from Natal, Brazil, they jump across to Dakar, Senegal, and work themselves from Marrakesh all the way to England. This is the route that they took, especially in the winter when the winds are fierce and the weather is not very good here. So the Azores is right there. The B-24s and 26s couldn't go to Dakar in one shot. They would go from Natal to the Azores, fuel up, and then go the shortest way to the continent, or go to Dakar also and work themselves north. Here are the northern routes. They would fly to Grand Isle, Grand Isle they call that, and then they go to Greenland, and then to cross the Iceland, and then to Scotland, usually Scotland there, Edinburgh, or they go straight like this. You can see that the distances are enormous. You're talking about 2,100 miles. And also they flew to the Azores this way, all depending on the weather. The big difference between the 42 and spring of 45, in 42, 43, the fighters did not escort the airplanes to the target. They couldn't. They ran out of fuel. They didn't have the tip tanks yet. They came later. When the P-40 51s and the 47s got tip tanks, the war changed. They escorted them all the way to Berlin. Here you see pictures of that. There was a lot of pain and stress and death going on, and the Germans, they didn't send one or two German fighters to a group of bombers. They would send hundreds of them, swarming all over the place. And the guys firing their guns like crazy to fend them off. Large German groups of fighters, very competent enemy pilots, very competent. But through the war, of course, the Americans kept on pounding on those with their larger number of P-51s and 47s, and the Germans lost a lot of competent pilots. So it was just a matter of cutting them down, less and less and less. So they didn't have the experience anymore. In 43, 44, the American bombers and fighters were still learning, but the pilots got better. Improvements, you can see here, we see already, here finally we got one in flames here. And this is a P-47. Strategic versus tactical. Strategic bombing was the Air Forces, or bombers, would bomb the targets like anything that had to do with war production. Aircraft plants, power plants, all of those pound on it day after day after day. The tactical part came later in the war. That's when you send your fighters low over the ground and hit trains, convoys, anything that is moving, that's tactical. Daytime precision versus nighttime. The American Air Forces did daytime precision bombing. The British Bomber Command did all at night. From 1939 to 1945 they did. Their war was much longer than ours. But they had learned that daytime precision was deadly, so they chose to go at night. The purpose of strategic bombing was to reduce the war effort of the Germans to nothing and get air supremacy. Supremacy means absolute control over the airspace, that the bombers can go and fly without getting jumped on by the Germans, and that is what they accomplished. The missions were prepared at 1700 hours at headquarters in England and in Italy, but the bomber warfare was very intermittent for the crew members. Bouts of inactivity, and they were bored out of their minds. They would sit out here and play cards, and if you were lucky, you go, after you come back from the combat mission, you had a clean bed, and if you're really lucky, maybe you'll find a girl with a warm heart somewhere in a pub, right? It's nothing better than having a nice girl. Excuse me, ma'am. You didn't bother me saying that, right? The young men, 19 and 20-year-old, they need warm bodies to hold on to. They were in terrible pain. The weather in England is terrible. It still is. But it wasn't, when I grew up, it was bad. Things have changed a little bit. The English weather is maritime, rain, fog. The summers are somewhat okay, but they can be cool, overcast and rain. That is what I grew up with. Today it's slightly different, but it's very uncomfortable. This is where the guys were sleeping in, Quonset huts. 2 times 4 officers in one Quonset hut. There was 8 of them officers, or 12 NCOs in one hut. And they each had a little pot-belly stove that they tried to heat themselves in that cold, miserable, moistest winter. So if you were on your neighbors on the list for the mission that evening, you go to bed early, you get woken up by the command corps. What's it called that now? CQ is officer of quarters. That he wakes you up and you have to sign that. Yep, I woke up. So it better be within a half hour. You better go and eat, because otherwise you don't get anything. Mission is at 0400, and then the engine starts at 06, taxi out 6:30, and at 0700 we're airborne. Now that is regardless of the weather. There could be fog, snow, ice. We gotta go. The mission goes on. So they were in sleet, freezing rain, pea soup, howling winds. You can imagine, we have it here, they got it over there too. Here's a young man, 19 years old, a pilot, first lieutenant already. He collided with another airplane in flight, dead. Here you see some of the collisions. Those are between airplanes. What kind of problems can you also have? An engine failure, a smoking engine, failed propeller, you fall out of formation. The formation would not stop for you. It keeps going. Friendly fire. They would shoot at each other by accident. This is when Germans would see this 20, 30 miles away. They see the smoke and they come right after you. Inside the airplane. Now seeing you. Inside the airplane with blood all over the place from bodies just bleeding, you know. And they would slip and slide, those poor guys. Not enough morphine, guys crying, you know. Airplane rolling and pitching. All that was going on in flight. Maybe you had a damaged parachute. Parachutes, you're scared to death. You're losing fuel, bailing out from 25,000 feet. I'll just keep going through this. This is what those guys could be. They go through horrendous agony. Here are the formation flying through anti-aircraft explosions. If you get hit, that takes your wing right off. And if you get shot down, you may end up in a POW camp. Temperatures could be as cold as minus 70 degrees at high elevations. Minus 70. In the summer, minus 50. In the winters, minus 70. Here you see a picture of guys, the airplanes on fire. The bailout call, they have a bell that rings, the pilot rings the bell, and you can hear this noise through the whole airplane. Bail out, bail out. This guy is hurt. The one that sits here, you got this kid out, and they're fired in the back. Those guys are ready to jump. They were if an airplane had problems, they would shoot flares off, and they had priority to land, and they would pick them up right there. This is the kind of airplanes that were coming in. It's hard to believe that we still fly an airplane like that. This one didn't make it. This one did make it. But the people inside didn't make it. You know something, how those pictures? those B-17s, and they were made sturdy. Here's one, that one didn't make it. Here the ball turret was completely knocked off. That guy died instantly, a direct hit. And if there was cannon fire, 20mm cannon fire from fighters, peppered them, and you could see there's only 40,000th of an inch thick metal. It goes right through it. So anybody who sits behind that is had it. You get it in your face, in your eyes. Here's one picture of a guy that blew half his face off. Yeah. Those are the ones that didn't even die. And they said, I will fly my required combat because I signed up for that. When my missions are over, I'm going home. And I have a strong belief in a positive outcome with God's help. And they went, many of them went to services before their flight when they knew they were going to Berlin, for instance. They knew many of them wouldn't come back, so they prayed to their God. The donut ladies were very popular after they came back. The guys were happy to have a coffee and a donut from the Red Cross girls. Mail call was fantastic, and also they would get weekend passes to go to Piccadilly Circus and go and dance with the local girls or write letters. When the war was over and you made it home, or if you hit the water and you were still alive, you belonged to the Goldfish Club or the Caterpillar Club if you jumped out and you survived. And if you were going home all together, you were a lucky bastard. Those are the kind of clubs that they carry proudly their cards with them. Entertainment, Bob Hope, of course, Piccadilly Circus, I'll go through that. Guys had plenty of money, girls loved it, right? Their uniforms, the equipment that they have, plugged into the outlets, everything, because it was so darn cold. During the training, the guys were not told what they were getting into, so they felt kind of a morale buster. The battle fatigue, flag happy, they call that. Many were very argumentative, didn't want to go and fly anymore, but those guys were well trained, so they didn't want to lose them, so they sent them to flag houses. And flag houses, they went for a week or 10 days. They had no talk about the war. They were very pretty girls there was no hanky-panky going on. They danced with the girls, had dinner with them. Those girls were professionals from the State Department to bring those guys back to combat without any touching at all. Post-war analysis, or the analysis is, the bombardier is the one that got it the most. 17.6% of all the casualties were up front, the first guy. So out of the 210,000 men who flew out of England with the 8th Air Force, 26,000 were killed. 21,000 became PW, that's 12.238%, that's high. Now you take the 8 and the 15 combined, they lost 6,800 bombers, just those two. And the 8th Air Force lost 4,300 plus another 3,300 fighter planes. If you you say, well, what happens if I get an airplane and has to dock, fly away to somewhere else? Well, they try to get to Switzerland or Sweden. Quite a few did, but they were not looked on very favorably. So all combat operations were halted in Europe on May the 8th. Many cemeteries in Europe, 472,000 men didn't come back. So there's quite a few American cemeteries in Europe, Ardennes, Brittany, Florence, Belgium, they got Lorraine, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Normandy. And here is one that I can speak personally from. 4 or 5 years ago, I visited this in the Netherlands, right here, that's where I'm born. There are 8291 crosses and another 1,700 names on walls from MIA. At exactly noon hour, and I didn't know this was going to happen, this bell tower plays every day the national anthem. And it just, you cry almost 82,000 men are buried here. They always played the national anthem for all those people that are buried here forever and ever. This is American soil. And all those, you see here, all those do the same thing. And all those, this is all World War II that I listed here. So, the guys were returning home. Women were happy to see them. And here is what they would sing. Sorry, I hit the button here. Welcome home parties. The GIs, many of them took advantage of the GI Bill, went to study. Many guys got their jobs back. And guess what happened? The guys got their jobs back. The women had to take a second seat and they were out, right? The minorities weren't always so fortunate either. There's a lot of battle fatigue going on. If you grandpas and uncles from those days came back from the battle, they would never talk about it. They felt nobody cared. And then, of course, right after the Cold War, an anti-communism starts. So we should not forget those people who died for us. So thank you. I was glad to be here.